for inviting me to speak at this meeting of the Birmingham case, the first big meeting like this, and for setting it in such a lively school. I've already been interviewed by him and a number of other pupils, very searching questions, but I didn't realise at the time, thank you for telling me, that it actually was the best school in the world. Now I know. And as for the drums, the only time I've heard such loud drums was in Singapore. Ladies and gentlemen, I owe a great deal to Case. As Lillian knows, in 1973, 4 years or so before my eldest daughter was 11, Case, led by Joan Salis, persuaded our local council, which was a Conservative council, to go comprehensive. And it meant that my 3 daughters could go to the local comprehensive school and start their education well. I wish the situation was as positive today for my grandchildren as it was then for my children. I fear, though, it isn't. My plan, can I have the next one, please? In the 35 minutes that I've got, is really just to go over some headlines. I'm afraid there won't be much time for detail. In 35 minutes, all I can do is to give an outline. And what I'll do is to talk about the strengths. And there are many strengths in our education system. With all the criticism, we sometimes forget to mention the strengths. I'll talk about the ambiguous features, and that's an interesting thing. Things that could be good in some ways and bad in other ways. Good in some hands, bad in other hands. And then I will talk about the weaknesses, which some of you, and Richard obviously from his comments a minute ago, will know about. I'll mention some of the government's current actions. So far, I can't really begin to guess what Michael Gove's going to do next. He keeps us all guessing. And I'll end with a list of what I think it's worth getting up early on a Saturday morning and coming to a conference like this. What it's worth fighting for in the education system for our children, our grandchildren, and their children. And I'll end not on a ringing conclusion, but on a question. And it's a genuine question to everyone here. What can we do next? What can we do if we're not happy about the situation, other than coming to conferences like this? What else can and should we do? Okay, well, let me get cracking. The first one, please. And I want to say this very clearly, absolutely clearly, as the politicians say. I want to be very clear on this. The best teaching I've seen, and since I left the Institute of Education, I've been very lucky, and I've been to schools pretty much all around the world. And I've spent a lot of time in the Nordic schools. They're my specialist areas, Norway and Denmark. Finland and Sweden to a lesser extent. But that's my patch. That's where I've spent most of the last 10 years, back and forth, including a spell living in Denmark. Sadly, not managing the language, although I did try, but it is fiendishly difficult, and it's no use making excuses like saying you're 35 years older than everyone else in the class, or you were still with your wife whereas everyone else was living with a Dane, or that they'd been there for a year and you'd only been there 3 weeks. Forget those excuses. It's a terribly hard language to learn. Although, having watched so much Danish television recently, you begin to get a bit more of an idea of it. But basically, the best teaching I've ever seen has been in England. I don't see English teachers as the problem. I see them as the solution. The problem, and I'm really worried about the problem isn't the teachers, it's the system in which the teachers have to work, and which parents have to use, and children have to attend. Okay, the next one, please, and let me go on to the strengths. Right, well, first of all, let me just say positive aspirations, and I want to give the politicians some credit for this. For all parties, over the last 30 years, our aspirations for what's possible in public education have risen. They've risen as our society has changed. When I started teaching in 1964, it was a different society, with a different work pattern, lots of unskilled jobs, lots of semi-skilled jobs, which has changed. It's changed a lot. And our aspirations, our realization that education is important, and is probably the key to our economic future, our social future, our survival really as a country worth living in, depends on education. Going to uni has become the thing for lots of kids who in the 60s or 70s wouldn't have dreamt of it. It was beyond them. Today it's become the normal thing, although sadly the tripling of fees I think is going to see a change in that and a reversal of an achievement that we really have got up to now. My second one, local democratic accountability, which, as you know from Richard's comments there, is being steadily removed. I actually believe that you do need to have schools in a local democratic relationship, so that if you're not happy, you know who to go to. You know to the councillors that you can go to, the councillors that you can not vote for, and that they have to take the big picture for the local area. It's still there, although each academy and each free school removes a little bit more of it. But I think it is one of the strengths of our system. The governing bodies, and I don't know how many people here are governors, but it's one of the best volunteer projects I've ever come across. I've met such terrific governors over the years who do it all for free. Now the new chief inspector thinks they should be paid and they might do it better. I'm not so sure about that. I've met some wonderful people doing it for nothing, for the commitment, for the society. Local management, whereby schools can organise a lot of things for themselves that in the past they used to depend on the local authority for. That's been good. I think there are some problems, there are some sillinesses for very small schools, all having to invent the wheel themselves, but on the whole it's worked well. And unlike governments of all the political parties, I think our teacher education system is pretty good when I compare it with systems around the world. It's not as good as Finland, and I'll come back to Finland because it is, I think, the best system in the world. And I was there just 3 weeks ago and I'm still full of excitement about it. It's not as good as there, where all teachers spend 4 or 5 years in university, not teacher colleges, not special places, but with everyone else in university, and come out with a master's level degree before they're allowed into a school. It's fantastic. Now the corollary of that, as I'll tell you later on, is that having invested so much in their training, they're then left to get on with the job. And as I'll tell you, no inspections, no big national examinations. They are trusted to get on with the job. A different world to our world. I think citizenship, which was included rather late in the national curriculum, is a strength, and I really say well done to David Blunkett for getting it in. In a democracy, it is terribly important. And how important in a vibrant, multicultural community like this one, where we want children to grow up together. How important that we actually deal with some of those tricky issues of citizenship in an open way. Of course, its future looks a bit grim as well at the moment. I'm very impressed with the quality of our head teachers. Well done, Moira. But I'm not convinced, I don't know if Moira is one, I may be in trouble here, I'm not convinced about superheads who manage 3 or 4 schools. Oh, phew, that's lucky. I don't think that's right. I think a head has to be a part of that community, a very important part of that community, a leader in the best sense of that community. I don't rate the Joseph Stalin school of leadership either. You know about Joseph Stalin? Of course, everyone knows about Joseph Stalin, a terrible Russian leader who had thousands and thousands of people killed and tortured, an absolute horror. And there was a joke going around amongst the Russians later when they had their glasnost and life changed in Russia. And a group of people got together and said, we can't have this, we want the certainties of the past. We know Stalin was a bit of an old so-and-so, but we'd like him back. So they go and pray by his mausoleum, and they pray for 3 days. And eventually there's a great groaning coming from the inside of the mausoleum, and this voice comes out, all right, I'll come back, but this time, none of that nice guy stuff. Well, that's one school of leadership. I'm not wild about that. On the other hand, there's the Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu, that Chinese scholar, one of the first mandarins, a librarian, and he wrote about leadership. He said, the best leaders are invisible. The people think they've done it for themselves. Well, that's nice. But there's a mid-course, And I go in the mid-course, I go with the Webbs, Sidney and Beatrice Webbs, important people in the 19th century, the start of feminism, the start of the Labour Party, the Fabians, busy people that had public lives and they had their own lives at home. And they decided they had to have a system. And the system was that they would divide decisions into two kinds, important ones and others. And of course, in the spirit of the times, in the early 20th century, Sidney decided he would take the important ones, and Beatrice was told she could take the others. The only thing was that Beatrice decided which decisions were which. And that, I think, is the key to good leadership. The leader who knows they have to take a decision, that's what they're paid to do, that's their job, or when they shouldn't, when they really have to consult with their colleagues, with their students even, with the community, and they know that and they can choose which is which. That's the leadership I like. Pedagogical skills, that's the skills of teaching, the art and science of teaching, which in England I think is a mixture of things. It's ambition for pupils, wanting them to do as well as possible, coupled with the skills today of data management, they have to be able to do that, but also enthusiasm and empathy. Empathy, that lovely word, not sympathy, but empathy. Being able to imagine what life is like for someone else. Someone from a different culture, someone from a different gender, someone from a different race, someone from a different class, someone with special needs. The teacher who's able to imagine themselves as that person and then relate to them as they would want to be related to. That's a wonderful strength. Some more strengths, the next one please. Very briefly now, I think our pastoral systems, the way we care for pupils, especially in the early years, are outstanding. Of course, sometimes they go wrong, but compared to many other countries, I think they're really good. The interest in learning and active learning is also impressive. Measuring, designing, making, surfing, or doing, rather than just sitting and listening. Outstanding music. Now, you don't find it everywhere. We had some outstanding drumming today. You don't find it everywhere, but some places you do. I can still remember the hairs on my neck lifting up when I observed Simon Rattle, the famous conductor, working with kids from inner London in the London School Symphony Orchestra. Kids from all nationalities, all races, working together for a week with this world-famous conductor. And just the rapport between them was fantastic. And that was in the old inner London days. The visually stimulating environments of school. Look around you, there's stuff everywhere. The flags, the pictures on the wall. It's wonderful. Primary schools are actually usually rather better than secondary ones in this connection. Wonderful photographs of children learning so that a child can see her or himself on the wall in a positive situation. Fantastic. And just two more things I want to add. One is school assemblies. You may think that's a strange thing to put as a strength, but I think it really is, especially again in vibrant communities, celebrating different cultural events, the time when the whole school community gets together. One more thing, the lack of retention. In France and French-speaking countries, they will keep kids down a year if they haven't passed. Sounds in theory okay, how can they go up if they haven't passed? But when you go into those classes and you see hulking great big boys, and it usually is boys, at the back of classes with little tiny children, it's desperate. And it's not good for the little children, of course, either seeing these bad models, and it's so embarrassing for the older kids. So we don't have that in our system, and that's something we should celebrate. And finally, the sense of fun, which is in so many of our schools, and is such an important thing, that learning can be hard. Of course, it can't all be fun, but lots of it can. And so many of our teachers are superb at making it so. I know a primary school where their motto is learning, love, and laughter. And that says it all. That's something really for us all to be very proud of. Okay, well, let's go on from the really good things. The next one, please. What I call the ambiguous features. And the first one is our national level of spending, which traditionally has been low. It improved under Labour, but although much of it was frittered away, I think, on some of their schemes, and now it's on the way down again. Let's look at the figures. The next one, please. And if you look at these figures, you see, wow, what a difference. UK on the left there, 11% of the public spending devoted to education. Look at Norway there. Now, it is a rich country, but 16%. Look at South Korea, another country with a very interesting, positive education system, 15%. The OECD, that's all these countries all around the world, all the sort of developed countries around the world, 13% compared to our 11%. Now, the interesting thing is Finland. Finland isn't very high. They do it not on resources, but they do it other ways, although they do use their resources well. Now, resources aren't everything. I've always argued this. Resources are necessary, but not sufficient to make a really great, effective school. And governments waste them. I think the private finance initiatives have been a disaster. And I think we do spend too much. £80 million for our secondary school in inner London, in Holland Park. £80 million, I think, is a heck of a lot of money. If we could spend 80 million on them all, maybe that would be something, but it's a heck of a lot of money. And the new guidelines from the minister are the opposite. They are for very small, penny-pinching schools. That won't be right either. We'll regret that later on. Just looking at what resources can do, the next one, please. Look at class size, which is something parents care deeply about. The research is a bit iffy on class size, but look at the differences here between UK, 26 overall, and look at even the United States, 13, and Norway, 11. Finland, which is right here behind me, where I was 3 weeks ago, 14. And I was in a number of schools there, and I didn't see a class with more than 14 students in it. So class size is important, and it's very important in parents' eyes. That's why so many parents say they want to go to private schools for the class size. There was an article in the paper, in The Guardian, last July, in which the person said this: what really matters is size. And this is where the state sector is still getting it wrong. Getting it wrong. The state sector would have as small classes as it could, but it depends on the money that it's given to it. And of course the teachers would love to have them. Okay, the next one, please. Some more ambiguous features, and I've got to be very quick on this. How am I doing? Okay. Well, assessment. Assessment is such, we spend our life talking about it these days. It's an essential part of the learning process. It provides teachers with vital information, identifying where knowledge and skills are secure, where they're not. Teachers use such information to help bring up pupils and to help give information to their parents on their progress. But that's a long way. That's the good use of assessment. The bad use of assessment is for accountability of teachers, league tables based on unreliable information that everyone takes seriously. And that leads to teaching to the test, the boring lessons. It leads to rehearsals of the SATs for weeks. A great book by Warwick Mansell called Teaching by Numbers, where he spent 2 years just going around schools and was appalled at the deadly, deadly lessons where kids were having to do it, and of course the teachers were having to do it because the whole future of the school depended on it. Heads would be fired, schools would be closed if they didn't pull up in these wretched league tables. And there's been such a kerfuffle over last year's GCSE results, and in English in particular, and so many children actually not getting a grade which, if they'd have sat the exam 6 months before, they would have done. And the recent law case actually turned them down. Unlike in Wales, where the minister took the decision and thousands of children were regraded. So assessment is really, really important, but we're not quite getting it right. It's an important part of schooling, but our governments are getting it wrong. No one wants a bad school, where the head has low aspirations, where children are maltreated, or teachers neglectful. So the next thing, inspections, has a good theory. The inspection is that inspections keeps everyone on their toes and keeps up standards. Not so sure. I was one of Her Majesty's inspectors briefly early in my career, and that was a different world. Since the inspection system was privatised by Kenneth Clarke, apparently the Queen was told, "Majesty, your inspectors are being abolished." "Oh, what have they done wrong?" she said. And I'm not sure Kenneth Clarke could really tell her, because it was a political move to privatise the inspection service. On Ofsted, well, a lot of luck as to who you get from Ofsted. You might get a very good, understanding, skilled and competent inspector, or you might not. It might seem a bit like the secret police. And the new chief inspector actually said, head teachers need reminding what stress really is about. At its best, it can validate the good practice that you're up to. At its worst, it takes confidence away from teachers, unless they've got a very strong head who can say, never mind, I rate you're an excellent teacher. Whatever the person said in their brief visit to your lesson, I know you every day, and could give the person that confidence. Without that, it can be disastrous. And the cost in 2013 for Ofsted, £176 million. Homework. Well, homework, it provides time for learning, which isn't there in the school day. It makes some pupils find it easier to work at home. They can be more creative. They work independently. Again, the theory is really good. The downside is that parents are tired, children are tired, and they're scratching over the homework not done. I'm sort of in two minds about it. My conclusion is that not in primary school. I don't think you should have it in primary school. I think children should relax with their parents in the evening, and they shouldn't be worried about learning those wretched spellings before the next day. But secondary school, I think we do need it, but it has to be very carefully used, not just for the sake of filling in time. It needs to be very well thought out. And that's that's exactly the line that Monsieur Hollande, the French president, is taking in France, where they're likely to abolish homework in the primary years and keep it for the secondary. School uniform, well, that ranges from Eton collars and 17th century cassocks to sweatshirts and trousers. I can see why schools go for uniform. They have to. They feel parents won't respect the school if they don't have it. Ideally, I don't like it. When I go to schools in Norway or in Denmark, they never have it. Kids are in jeans and sweatshirts, and they seem fine to me. And there's an awful lot of hassle I've seen in schools about homework, but I understand why people use it in our English system. Out-of-school activities, the only ambiguous thing about that, of course, is that you have to pay for them. They're fantastic, and I've seen such wonderful things over the years, and I think it's very sad that people have to pay, and poor families just can't afford to do it if they've got 3 children. It's a huge amount of money, and that can't be right. We should have it built in. Okay, the next one, this is the serious weaknesses, and I must keep an eye on the time now. I'm going to have to talk even faster. Sorry. The over-dominance of politicians. I want to quote Michael Bassey, over the last quarter of a century, education has been pushed and pulled and twisted by the politicians. It must now be recognised that it hasn't worked. And he goes on to say, politics has polluted the schools and is failing our children. Governments have been actually over the years more, sometimes much more interested in education and sometimes not. Recently they have, and Tony Blair of course made this great education, or as I rephrase it, interfere in education, his watchword. Of course politicians have a central role in our democratic society. We elect them on our behalf. We expect them to take decisions and make wise decisions on behalf of us. But that doesn't mean to say they're entitled to introduce any changes that they fancy, regardless of the evidence, regardless of what anyone else says. You will all have your examples of bad education policies over the years. My favourites are Kenneth Clarke's abolition of HMI, John Patton's introduction of specialist schools, when we already had a system that was too specialised already, and we were complaining about young people only doing 3 A-levels and being too specialised. And what does he do? Introduce specialist schools. David Blunkett's turnaround on selection, remember, Watch My Lips and all that, and then actually supporting selection. Estelle Morris's promotion of faith schools, which in a very divided society I don't think was the brightest idea. And Michael Gove's invention of free schools at a time when actually we're supposed to be dealing with austerity. Okay, no, not yet, sorry, not yet. The market model, and this I really think is the devastating about our system. Let me just say, it's utterly inappropriate. What we've learned about markets is that they benefit the advantaged, and the disadvantaged have to take the leftovers. And yet that's the system that both Labour and Conservative and the Liberals alongside have gone for. A market model of education, a market model for our children? That can't be right. Private schooling, well, no time to go into it all, but I think private schooling, we have some fantastic private schools, but that is for a very small number. In society, they are divisive. They extract too many advantaged pupils from the system, and actually if you have only poor people in a system, somehow you end up with a poor system, and that can't be right. You need a mixture of things. They foster snobbery, that sense of entitlement that we see so many of our ministers displaying, and they perpetuate unhealthy networks of influence. Numbers, 7%, it's nothing. But how come 50% of the people going to our most prestigious two universities, Oxford and Cambridge, come from private schools? So it's gone from 7% to 50%. And if you look at the top most influential jobs in the country, it would be more than 50%. That can't be right. Selection, which of course was the starter of CASE, should have been eliminated in 1944. And Labour governments have messed up the opportunity ever since. At critical times, they've had the opportunity. You only have to look at the programme on the secret history of the grammar schools that some people in this audience have been complaining about for the last, how many months? 14 months, to see the bias that's built in there. You only have to look at some research done for Buckinghamshire, which still has some grammar schools, on the necessity of coaching. Unless you can afford a lot of coaching, forget it. Crucially, desperately unfair. Ability grouping, that's a tricky one. I'm actually critical of it, but I don't know quite what to put in its place. This is where I think we need many, many more experiments. There was a paper from the Institute of Education, my old place, just last week, talking about streaming in the primary school and how devastating it was in terms of lowering expectations. If the teacher says you're only a B or a C, tells the parents, what can the child think? But I am a B or a C. And that can't be right. In Finland, no streaming at all by law. They say we cannot. The minute you stream, you lower expectations. A quickie, the lack of adequate, affordable preschool care. Again, our society is a shambles. We expect both parents to work, but we don't provide the sufficient resources for them to do so. Go to Denmark, or to Finland, or to Norway, and see the preschool care that is there. It's fantastic. And of course, no scope for innovation. Because we're so tied in with the league tables and the inspectors calling, everyone's terrified to innovate. How can they risk innovation? And yet, we need to innovate if education is to develop, to change with a changing world. And you can only do that if you're trusted and allowed to do it. How can we solve problems like grouping unless we're allowed to innovate? Okay, well, the next one, please. Have the government's actions address these weaknesses I've been talking about? Well, the white paper, some silly ideas there. Army officers to solve problems in schools. I've trained army officers, and often the problem is that they're hopeless on discipline. They can do it with guns and sticks and things, but not with children who say why. Changing the nature of academies. Well, at least I had reservations about academies right from the start, but at least Labour were aiming them at the most disadvantaged areas and saying we'll give extra resources there. The current government has changed that, and they're often the most advantaged places that are getting even more advantages. Free schools, at a time when we're desperately short, when the birth rate is going up, not, I think, a good idea. Further reducing the powers of local authorities when we need that overall supervision. Cutting the educational maintenance allowances. Not much, a little bit, but it kept a lot of kids in the system, which they're not now. And allowing this idea that selection might increase. Michael Gove said, "My foot is hovering on the pedal," and that was the pedal of allowing selection and cancelling the building programme. The next one, please. Promoting untrained teachers and saying through free schools and academies, you don't have to be trained. Oh, what a retrograde step. Conjuring up an EBAC. Oh, this exam reform is such a muddle. Our system was terrible. 30 years ago, I had such trouble explaining it to people from abroad. How can you have a system which only passes, and passes was, of course, 5 O-levels at a certain standard. How can you have a system which only passes about 20%, 25% of pupils for a national system? That's madness. Slowly over the years, it's crept up with all sorts of changes and things. It crept up to 60%. So what does Michael Gove do? Introduces an E-back and sends it right down to below 20% again. It's as if he doesn't want people to succeed. He wants less people to do well in schooling. The curriculum, well, that's been a muddle as well, a terrible muddle, and having a politician decide the history curriculum can't be good in a democracy. Selling off playing fields, the university fees, and of course the bullying of the civil servants by the special advisors all comes in there. It's all a bit of a muddle that the current government hasn't worked with. I think they have a theory that more must mean worse, and they want to turn the clock back to how society was in the 1950s when poor people knew their place. And we're going to end up, if we're not careful, I think, with a 2 or a 3 class system. And that isn't good, because we know it'll be the rich and the very, very clever, the exceptionally clever perhaps, but the rich who get the best. And the rest, and the child from a disadvantaged family, the child with a family's fighting for survival, coping with every difficulty there is, the child that needs education more than all the others, will be the child who's left out at the end. And that can't be right. That can't be right. And as Richard said in his introduction, we know waiting on the sidelines are all these companies desperate to come in and make some money from the public education system. So let me end really with the vision of what I think is worth fighting for. I haven't got time to go into the details, but it's all in my book, which is coming out in September. You'll be able to get then. But it's there. But I do have a vision. Are we on to the next one? Yes, thank you very much. Of something that is worth fighting for the majority of our children, which creates future citizens likely to promote a good society. Now, none of these things will be easy, but like Finland, who took 20 years to get their system right, they're worth pursuing. Let's start with the beginning. A national preschool care system, which actually copes with working parents and with children. Extending the nursery provision, I think, up to 6. 5 is too early for formal learning, too early to learn to fail at 5. Decommissioning that wretched education market and doing away with the league tables, giving local authorities reasonable powers over all the schools in their area, and establishing balanced schools. And I wish I had a couple of hours to go into the details of why I think just a local school isn't good enough. Because a local school, if you're in a poor area, is for poor children. A local school in a rich area is for rich children. I really think we need to find ways of getting a balance of pupils in schools. All the research I've done shows that the most effective schools are the ones that have a balance. Okay, you can cope with a lot of kids with problems if you've got a lot of kids who actually are good at learning. You can cope, you're a balanced community, and it reflects our society as it is. If only we can have that. And we need to balance the teachers as well. I won't make myself popular with the teacher unions, but I would want to balance the teachers and balance the pupils to make a system for everyone. I actually would outlaw selection. And I would make religion, I'm not religious, but I'm not anti-religious, but I would have it outside of the schooling. They could all religions could have someone who goes in and after school could take classes, voluntarily basis. But I would remove this ever closer linking between religion and schooling. The private schools, I would offer them the chance to come in, perhaps as sixth form colleges, to use them. Imagine the boarding facilities, that if all kids could have a year boarding in somewhere like some of those wonderful sites that private schools have. And of course I'd reconfigure inspection so that it was done by practicing teachers, and it would only be done in certain ways, not like our secret police. And we would have a standing education commission to make non-political changes. I've mentioned Finland, but Finland has great teacher education. It has respect for its teachers. It is a reading society. There are no inspections. There are no public examinations in that way. There are small classes. They have a good reading recovery system, so that any child who has problems, they move in very, very quickly and deal with them. And what's more, they have a free meal, and they've had it since the war, a free meal for every child in the whole system. They knew their only future, because they were slaughtered with reparations from Russia after the Second World War, their children was their future. So they wanted a good education system, and they wanted to feed them up. And they've done that right the way through. And it is fantastic. They are probably the best, I think, system in the world. So a cluster of developments, all they're needing to be thought through. But let me end in the next one, please. How can we achieve a vision like that? How can we do it? Through the coalition government? Through a Labour government? Fiona Miller, who's a very committed Labour Party person, wrote a nagging sense of uncertainty that Labour could develop a coherent set of proposals that restore confidence and belief in a high-performing public education system as the route to a fairer society. If she's saying that, I read Andrew Adonis's book with some hope, but I found it desperately anti-comprehensive, a cancer at the heart of society. Comprehensive schools! And he was wanting to take power from local councillors and give it to businessmen. It was also very aggressive, attacking people. Ted Ragg, who kept teachers going through years of reform, was attacked. Clearly his humour didn't go down well in Downing Street. And poor old Michael Marland, who was a great innovator in comprehensive schools, mocked because he wore a bow tie. I was worried when I read it, because it just seemed to be more of the same. And I thought, is that going to be Labour policy? More of the same. And if even a fairly progressive person like Andrew Adonis is stuck in that well-worn rut, what chance is there? No chance, unless we, the people, assert ourselves. And that's my question to you. How can we do that? We come to meetings like this, we fire ourselves up, but what then? How can we get politicians to really listen to us? Well, maybe during the day you'll come up with some solutions. I hope so. Thank you very much. Next one, please. Thank you.